The sound of that bell brought every man and woman to work at the cotton mill in Marysville, the definitive company town. Time has passed Marysville by, and the people here like that just fine. The town straddles the Nashwauk River in northern New Brunswick, much the same way that it did when it first sprang to life in the 1860s. It boasts 150 buildings that predate the 1900s. The people living in the neat rows of red-bricked houses are intensely proud of Marysville's history. That's because many are the direct descendants of the original mill workers who walked down to the cotton mill every day.
The bell would ring at 6 o'clock, and then another bell would ring at 10 to 7. That means you had 10 minutes to get to work, and it was kind of neat. I never heard the first bell, but the second bell I would. And it was kind of, I don't know, it just made you feel good, you know. And you'd look out if you happened to be up and see everyone going to work with a lunch kettle, you know.
Doreen Doherty has lived in this same house for the past half-century. She was born in the town, just like her father, Frank, who worked at the mill all his life. When they first moved in, the rent was $20 a month.
When we first knew we were going to get this, we were really excited, you know, a full bathroom, you know, 3 bedrooms. We felt we were coming up in the world.
For Doreen, growing up in Marysville was a child's dream. Every house on the tidy streets had an open door. The whole town seemed to be their playground, without walls or fences.
I think it was wonderful myself. You knew everybody, and there was everything here in the town for us. We had a nice swimming pool. As a young child, I just felt secure growing up here. Everybody would sit out in their steps here, and you holler back and forth to people, but everybody would be going to the ball game, and the cars would be lined up the whole street and around the other, and it was exciting. It was great.
Of the 56 tenement houses built for the mill workers of Marysville in the 1880s, 53 survive to this day, and they are as sturdy as the day they were built by the carpenters from the cotton mill.
It was the only industry in the town. So you either worked in the mill or you had to go elsewhere. If anybody had trouble, everybody helped. If anybody was sick, couldn't work, a collection was taken up, and we all helped one another. It was a feeling of family.
The houses are clustered around the mill itself. They were copied from northern English towns of the Industrial Revolution. Marysville even has its own Coronation Street. The houses, indeed the whole of Marysville, were all part of a master plan created by Alexander Gibson. He even named the new town after his wife Mary when he arrived here in 1862. Gibson was known to everyone in Marysville simply as Boss. And with good reason. His workers knew everything had to be done his way, or they'd be on the next train out of town. A Fredericton journalist wrote,
"A town of 2,500 inhabitants owned and controlled by one man, more absolutely than the Tsar of Russia controlled his vast domains."
Boss Gibson had big plans for Marysville. It would be the springboard for a growing empire of sawmills, clay pits, grist mills, railroads, and ships. But it was the opening of the cotton mill in 1887, 1,000 kilometers from the nearest cotton field, that put Marysville on the industrial map.
It may seem odd to people to come to Marysville and say, well, why would they have built a cotton mill here in the middle of nowhere? I mean, there's no cotton fields nearby or anything like that. But the Dominion of Canada was young at the time, and under the government of Sir John A. Macdonald, there was a policy that was put forward of protective tariffs, which was called the national policy.
The national policy shut the door on cheap American imports. But strangely, raw cotton was not affected.
The only reason the cotton mill is here is because he wanted it here. There was really no natural advantage to having a cotton mill in Marysville and New Brunswick. The reason it's here is that he sold his interest in a large railway interest. He was involved in the New Brunswick Railway Company, and he received $800,000 cash. And in 1883, he decided to reinvest in another industry other than the lumbering industry or the railway industry, and he decided on cotton.
In the decade before a new Canada was created by Confederation, 90% of New Brunswick was wild timber country. Only axemen and sawyers ventured out into the bush that sprawled across 73,000 square kilometers. They were a tough bunch of men, but none more so than Alexander "Boss" Gibson. At 6 foot 6 inches tall, people said he looked like a cross between Buffalo Bill and Brigham Young.
Well, I suppose there was a certain fear of any employer who had the power over his employees that Gibson must have had, but at the same time, he seems to have commanded a great deal of respect.
When he came in 1862, he recognized very quickly the reason that the existing mill wasn't profitable was that the water was low at a number of times during the year. So he quickly started to get into damming the Nashwauk River. He put 7 dams on it, and then again he had a steady supply of lumber. And with that steady supply of lumber, he was able to cut year-round, and that increased his revenues.
Gibson's first 20 years in Marysville was a period of feverish building and non-stop expansion. His army of 1,500 men created the most modern company town in the province. Gibson's list of operations was impressive. Shingle mills, a large leather mill, an ice cutting operation on the St. John River. Even a fleet of his own ships to carry his lumber to England. But the crowning achievement would not come until 1883, when Boss Gibson decided to build a cotton mill in Marysville.
There was a fairly steep learning curve for him because they had no knowledge of how to run this. So all of the technology had to come out of the United States.
The enormous 4-story mill needed 1 million feet of southern hard pine for the framework. And the foundation was built from stone quarried from Gibson's own land. Its floor space covers 5.5 acres. The new mill could accommodate 60,000 spindles, making it one of the biggest cotton mills in the country. Now all Gibson needed to complete the big picture were workers. In the mill's first year of operation, he employed 425 people and produced $500,000 worth of cloth. Two-thirds of the mill's workforce were female, and the boss made sure that young single women coming to work at his mill were well cared for.
His workforce came from, would have been the rural areas at the time. This was the peak of the Industrial Revolution in both Canada and in Europe, the middle 1880s. And so he was drawing a lot of rural people in, and particularly women. So the women would come in, and there was a hotel built specifically for young women as a place for them to stay. And they, again, would possibly marry. Then they would be eligible to get one of the quarters, one of the duplex tenements, and if they stayed here for the rest of their life, they would have housing for the rest of their life.
Boss Gibson's new town was the top of the line. In other industrial centers, the workers lived in abject squalor. Gibson's employees were well housed, and their children went to school.
They had as good of amenities as you could have for the time, and he firmly believed that well-fed and warm and comfortable workers were a more productive worker, and he certainly differed from some of his colleagues that had other enterprises in Canada and the United States.
He ran a company store where all the employees shopped, but the stories come up again and again that at Christmas, after the store was closed down, he would go in and go through the credit slips because everybody bought on credit till payday.
Afternoon, Louise. Grab out the ledgers, please.
If he was having a particularly good year, he would go into his store and take the ledger with all of the accounts for his employees in it, and he'd throw them in the stove and tell the accountant to allow the employees to know that their accounts had been wiped clean.
Boss Gibson's grand plan for his model company town was unfolding just as he expected. From his grand mansion high on Nob Hill, he could survey his creation every day with deep satisfaction. His insatiable appetite for building was crowned by a magnificent Methodist church in the town. But one day, it would signal Marysville's fall from grace. Marysville existed only for Boss Gibson, and everyone who lived there knew it. He treated his workers well, but he expected them to work hard. Workdays were 12 hours long, and the conditions were grueling.
It was noisy, it was hot, it was dusty and humid, but at that time, it was very much a way of life for us here in Marysville, yes. Most of us knew that we'd probably grow up and go to work in the cotton mill. back then that kids would go to work at maybe 11 years old, work in the mill, and then the inspector would come to check to see the age, and they'd hide the boys in bobbin bins and cover them with bobbins so they couldn't see the kids.
The company town of Marysville would not have been complete without a church. Or, to be more specific, a Methodist church. Boss Gibson decided he would build a new one and spared no expense.
It was quite a spectacular building, but I know that he brought in materials from all over North America and some from Europe. This, of course, would be select woods, and brought in cabinet makers as well from Europe and all over North America. It's not coincidental that he built it at the same time that the Anglican Cathedral across the river was being built. And it's also not coincidental that the steeple here was 10 feet higher than the Anglican steeple. Boss was not content with being in second place.
Having built his dream church, Gibson never missed a Sunday service there. As a man who liked to get straight to the point, he had pretty strong ideas about what kind of service should be conducted there.
The story I hear most often in the church is that Boss would sit in the back of the church each Sunday, and if the preacher went too long, he simply began to tap his cane on the floor. And the preacher would stop, or the preacher would soon thereafter leave. There was no question about that.
But the tide was slowly turning against Boss Gibson. The cotton cartel of mills in Montreal that he had once refused to join was now undercutting his prices and taking away his market. Supplies of timber on his vast land holdings in northern New Brunswick were dwindling. His once endless cash flow was drying up. At the age of 88, he sold the mill and its houses to the cotton cartel, now the biggest employer in Canadian industry, for a paltry $1.25 million. But the final blow to Gibson's wounded pride was just around the corner. In 1911, the sound of fire bells echoed through Marysville. Everyone raced to his beloved church.
Almost 40 years after it was built, on a Sunday afternoon just after the service, it caught fire. Nobody knows how, but of course then it was heated with wood, and so presumably something in the heating system gave way, and it burned spectacularly to the ground.
A broken man, Boss Gibson died of pneumonia just 2 years later. It was the end of an amazing era for Marysville. But even in death, Boss Gibson would still be in command. His family's burial plot at the Marysville Cemetery is a final salute to the great man.
There is a cenotaph to mark Boss's grave, sitting at the prominent point, the high point of the cemetery. And the family plots then are laid out in a circle around his grave, all facing in to him. And it's an eloquent symbol of his place in the community.
Market economics and a flood of cheap imports finally caught up to Marysville on Valentine's Day, 1954. The mill was closed down. In one memorable day, workers lost their jobs, but were offered the chance to buy their rental houses for $2,000.
We were just devastated. We just thought we were gonna starve to death. Sold them for $2,000. So, doesn't sound like much today, but back then, that was a lot of money. And, but people coped, and Oh, we're not wimps here in Marysville. We're a hardy bunch here, and we made it through.
The people that lived down in front of the mill, of course, there would be noise all night. And when the mill shut down, they couldn't sleep because the noise was gone. Sounds strange, but the noise was gone.
In 1982, the empty cotton mill was rescued from decay by the New Brunswick government, renovating it into government offices. Marysville itself was also overtaken by progress, the only company town to be designated a National Historic District. It has now been swallowed up by the city of Fredericton and reduced to the status of a suburb.
We've been here 68 years and it's home. You know the people, though they have changed. It's still a close-knit community. It is Fredericton now, but it'll always be Marysville to some of us.